Last year I had to remote in, and that was fun. That was kind of cool. But wow, it's so different to be here in person. And for those of you who are online, I really encourage you. It's a whole different thing to be here present with God's people and experience worship together. Well, you chose an amazing theme for this year, the neighbor or the world next door. I'm excited about that particular topic. And I was kind of reflecting on it. Lord, how do I come to the Scriptures in a way that will really encourage your own efforts, not just to the ends of the earth, and we want to keep doing that. We're not just about Avon, we're about the whole world. But it's also true that we want to reach out to the nations that are coming into our midst. And we have people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation who are here with us now. I love that picture of the Afghan family. Afghanistan has been on my heart for many years. I had one of my students actually has been 30 years working in Afghanistan, just completed his doctoral dissertation on the church in Afghanistan. Now, you can't get a copy of this paper, and I'll never tell you his name for obvious reasons. But the story that dissertation tells of a church emerging in the midst of suffering in Afghanistan, and frankly, the church in Afghanistan is called the fastest growing church in Asia. And that's going to continue. And we have a large group of Afghans coming here to the United States, and we have an amazing opportunity to show them the love of Christ in a place where there is freedom and safety. So friends, let's not miss that opportunity. And I want to encourage you as you do that outreach. I know you're going to be adopting at least one Afghan family. I have a book which I want to give you for free. It's a book I wrote. It's not highly technical. It's only 98 pages long. I think there's only 3 footnotes, so don't be afraid that you're going to get a bunch of scholarly gobbledygook. And I have outside on my table where the CIU little banner is put with a few other materials that you can look at. There are 2 sign-up sheets there. All I need is your name and a carefully printed email address, and I will send you an electronic copy of that book. And I hope it'll help you as you think through how best to learn about the worldview of your people. The book is called The 7 Essential Questions of Life, and I've been using it for many years, teaching people how to understand somebody else's worldview. And that fits in with some of the themes that we're going to look at today. What does it mean to listen well? Now, the scripture passage that God brought me to as I was reflecting on this, and I've actually never done a study on this book before. I don't know why, but I just haven't. But I decided to go to the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is the story of a refugee. Not just once, but twice. And the amazing things that refugee goes through. And I selected for a scripture passage, a passage that isn't usually selected from Ruth. In fact, one of your people in the technical department said, "You really want to read this? For your scripture passage for the morning?" And the answer is yes, I do. Now, we're going to look at some other things, but I really want us to focus on the experience of a woman named Naomi. Did you know what Naomi means? It's a Hebrew word, and it means pleasant. Pleasant. That's a nice name to have. I don't know if you've ever had friends who had interesting names. One of my students a few years back had come from Africa, and his name was Kennedy, which is frankly not very, it's a fairly common thing that people will get a famous person's name in different parts of the world. Castro is another favorite in certain places. But Naomi was meant to, through the name, describe the personality of the person and who they were, at least the aspirations that the parents had for her. So we're going to start at chapter 1, and I'm just going to read 3 verses 19 through 21. And this is the final stage, if you will, in the refugee migrant experience of Naomi. And so at verse 19, it says this: "So the 2 women went on," and the 2 women, of course, are Naomi and Ruth, for whom the book is named. "So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem, When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Now, why would they ask a question like that? Well, maybe if you've been through 15 years of what Naomi had been through, and you were in the tattered clothing that Naomi was wearing, and you had the lines in your face that what she had been through had created, maybe people would have been saying, is that really Dave Cashin? Or is that, your pastor? So they say that, and they use the name, pleasant, Naomi. Naomi gives a powerful response. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So what does Mara mean? Well, you can probably guess from the context. It means bitterness. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitterness. Now, in some ways, we're a little, from a New Testament perspective, we have a bit of a struggle with this because, what does Hebrews 4:12 tell us? Be careful that no root of bitterness rises up within you and many be defiled. We sort of think that's not a very good attitude. Well, we haven't been through what Naomi has been through, have we? None of us has had an experience even close to this. So the rest of my sermon, I kind of want to walk you through, first and foremost, Naomi's experience. We're going to get that in the first 18 verses of the book. And then we want to kind of switch our focus to look at what a certain person does for this refugee family, for this broken refugee family. And out of that, we're going to discern what I like to call 4 Boaz principles. And these are principles that I'd like you to really reflect on in your own personal life. How can I apply these principles in my life as I seek to minister to the world next door? How should I put myself into the hands of God to so effectively minister to this family as Boaz ministered to the family of Naomi? So let's begin our story by looking at the reality of Naomi's story and, of course, Ruth's story, because she also becomes a refugee, if you will. And let's begin in the very first verse. "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." Now, this is just a short verse or two. There's a world that lies behind these 2 verses. I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in a famine. Right now, Afghanistan is about a week away from massive famine. We've seen famine break out in other places. I have seen mild famines in a place called Bangladesh. When I served there as a missionary, it was the poorest nation on earth. And a large percentage of the population in Bangladesh at that time were landless laborers. Now, what's a landless laborer? Well, that's the kind of person who goes out into the fields of other farmers and works to harvest the crops and gets a small portion of the crop as payment. And usually that's just enough for that person to feed his or her family. Nothing beyond that. We're talking 50 cents a day. What do you do in the times when there's no harvest going on? Well, in Bangladesh, there was a way to kind of scrape by when there wasn't ways to gather food by the work that you did. You could be involved smashing bricks. Smashing bricks. Well, Bangladesh is a country that doesn't have any natural heavy stone like granite and that sort of thing. So if you want to build a highway in Bangladesh, you smash bricks. And you'd drive along the highways in Bangladesh and lining for miles sometimes. You'd see these scenes of thousands of people. And they were usually whole families, father, mother, 2 or 3 kids, sometimes down to age 5, and they're all sitting on a pile of bricks, and they're taking the nub of what's left of a hammer, and they're smashing the bricks into pieces. And if they can get a cubic yard at the end of the day, all gathered together, they'll get $1. Now, this is in the middle of the day when the heat is hot. Maybe you've got an umbrella, maybe you don't. Maybe you've just got some piece of paper or a little piece of cloth to put on your head. Imagine doing that all day and trying to survive. When you look at the tragedies that happened later in Naomi's life, understand it had something to do with their lifestyle. How did they survive in Moab? I don't know, but I do know this. It was worse than Bangladesh in 1985, without a doubt. So, refugees and what they go through. What is the life of a landless laborer? Well, it gets worse, beginning at verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion, these are Naomi's 2 sons, also died, and Naomi was left without her husband and her 2 sons. Wow. By the way, just show of hands here, how many of you think you're going to get Social Security someday? I know this can sound political, but how many of you think how many of you are actually on Social Security right now? Got a few people out there? Yeah, okay. So we've got our plans for retirement, right? We got plans for how we take care of ourselves when things get rough, right? When we get old. What was the form of Social Security for an Israelite foreigner in Moab? She's not a citizen, right? The only security she has is her husband and her sons, and they're all dead. Wow. When you see a person in this kind of a situation, you wonder, this looks like the end, doesn't it? Well, at this point, an interesting thing happens, and I'll read from verse 6 and 7, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on here. There's a change of the circumstance in Judah. The famine has ended. There's food there for the people. And when Naomi hears this, she makes a decision. Now, Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. She and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to Judah. Now, when you think road, don't think highway, think cowpath with lots of rocks in it. And I don't know exactly where this event happens, but Naomi gets partway down the road and she realizes there's not much hope for these 2 girls. I've got 2 widows in my care, and I can hardly take care of myself. It would be much more sensible to send these 2 women home. So she turns around and she says to them, go back to the house of your father and marry other men and have children and families and be taken care of in that way. I can't do anything for you. I have no future that I can see for you. At which point, one of the daughters-in-law, Orpah, she says, that's pretty sensible. Let's do the sensible thing. And she kisses her, and she turns and goes back to her father's house. But the other person, Ruth, makes this speech, and typically when people quote Ruth, they will quote this particular speech, because Ruth essentially confesses faith in the God of Israel in her statement. Now, remember, we're in Moab. We're in her home country. We're in her place. And she makes this sterling declaration to Ruth that anything but death will not separate me from you. I will go where you lay down, I will lay down. Where you sleep, I will sleep. Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. It is, in essence, a conversion speech. By the way, for those of you who think that Naomi wasn't very spiritual, I find it very interesting how much her daughters-in-law loved her. Orpah maybe not quite as much as Ruth. But in spite of her bitterness, this lady had demonstrated for these Moabite women what faith in the God of Israel was all about, even in the worst of circumstances. So Ruth clings to her, and she makes that powerful statement, "Your people will be my people." Now, the we-them mentality we understand, don't we? Those people over there, they're different from us. We don't want to have anything to do with them. We stay in our little ghetto. You stay in your little ghetto. I stay in my silo. You stay in your silo, right? We have a society today that's very siloized. And then this remarkable thing happens when Ruth says, "No, I'm going to your silo. I'm going to your hometown. I'm going to join your people." Now, here's an interesting thought, kind of a reversal on this. Think about the fact that when refugees come to our area, they are those people. How about you saying, "Your people will be my people"? Now, you're not going to go too far. You're not going to say, "Your God will be my God," because we know the truth that we have in Jesus. But at the same time, your people will become my people. I will invite you to become part of my people. You see, the most powerful thing you can do for a refugee is to make your family their family. And we're going to look at some of the principles that derive from this. What does it mean to say to someone who is those people, "You will now be my people"? So let's begin to look at some of these Boaz principles that I mentioned earlier. The first reality is the bitterness of Naomi. And we've already read that passage where she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." Now, I can guarantee you that every refugee you'll ever meet has been through some bitter, bitter experiences. I can remember on the news a few days ago, actually, they had an Afghan lady who used to be a member of the parliament and big in government for women's affairs, and she has now taken with her one suitcase, and she's left everything else behind to come to the United States. Lost absolutely everything, and that's probably typical of every refugee who comes to the United States. And not a few immigrants coming to America face the same kinds of loss, not just of family ties, but of economics, of prized and beloved possessions, everything wiped out in a moment. Now, is our inclination to listen to that? You know, it's an interesting thing about Americans. We kind of live in our own little world. I think I experienced that for the first time when I came back after living a couple of years in Saudi Arabia. It wasn't a Christian at the time. And I wanted to tell all my friends in high school what I had experienced in Saudi Arabia. And I've been through some pretty wild stuff. I'd, taken a boat steerage class from, Mombasa, Kenya to Mumbai, India. And I'd been involved in a terrible automobile accident in India. And, we tented across Saudi Arabia. We'd done some freaky stuff. And I'd get about 30 seconds into my description. And the kids would sort of yawn and say, "Well, let's talk about the Red Sox." Or how about the Patriots? How do you think they're going to do this year? This kind of stuff. There was complete, utter, total disinterest in any of the things that I had gone through. And this is pretty typical. We don't pay attention to things that don't particularly interest us. Now, a few years ago, I was invited to speak, do a missions conference, if you will, at a church up in New Hampshire. And that church was interested, as you are now, in reaching out to the refugees and the immigrants in their area. And they wanted me to teach all Saturday afternoon, and I thought, no, that's not something I'm going to do. I'm not going to, after a heavy lunch, we're going to sit and fall asleep while Cashin drones on. I thought, we've got to do something different. And I had found out from the church that there was a community of Bhutanese refugees. And I thought, well, for Saturday afternoon, instead of teaching on principles, let's just go out prayer walking and see if we can meet some people. And so we split up into 5 groups of 5, and I took one group with me, and we went to a certain area. And the interesting thing was, in the course of the afternoon, every single group made a strong personal contact with a Bhutanese refugee. Oh, excuse me. Some of you may not know who Bhutanese refugees are, right? Well, about in the 1990s, the Buddhist government of Bhutan decided that they had too many pesky Nepali-speaking Hindus in their country, and they drove them out by force, burned their villages down, killed some of their people, and they had to wander across the border into Nepal. And the Nepalese put them in refugee camps where they stayed for 20 years. Many of the older members of that community died in the refugee camps. Then, finally, a number of nations, including the U.S., took pity on these people and allowed them to migrate to the United States. So I'm walking along the street with my group of 4 others, and we run into a young man, and I recognize him as being from that part of the world, and I ask him, are you from Bhutan? And he said, yes. Wow. And we struck up a conversation, and at one point I asked him, tell me some of the things that you have been through as a refugee coming from Bhutan. Well, that was the right question to ask. He launched into about a half-hour monologue telling us about what it was like to have his village burned down. He was a young child at the time. What it was like to grow up in a refugee camp. What it was like to bury his mother and his father. They couldn't even do the proper Hindu rites in a refugee camp. And then to leave everything behind to come to a new place. We learned the Boaz principle of listening. Of listening. How well do you listen? Part of my purpose with my book, The 7 Essential Questions of Life, is to teach you how to ask good questions and how to listen well. Because if you listen well, friends, you're unusual. You're very unusual in the culture in which we live today. So, what we find in the scriptures here is that Boaz listens very well. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the passage starting at verse 11, there's a first conversation between Boaz and Ruth. Ruth has been out picking in the fields, and Boaz sees her, calls her over, and he makes the following statement. I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. Now, this is the first conversation. How does he know all this stuff? He grew up in a culture that knew how to listen and how to talk about circumstances. And Boaz's ear is to the ground. Without even talking to Ruth, he is listening very, very well. But he's not only just hearing her story, he is showing compassion. He listens with compassion to the reality of what Ruth has gone through, and obviously Naomi as well. So that's your principle. Boaz principle number 1, learn how to listen to people. Second principle is the principle of hospitality. Now, this is not a particularly strong American point. I don't know if you sort of noticed that. I've been invited into the homes of many foreigners, not very often into American homes. And foreigners who come to America often experience that. I used to be, or I still am, a coin dealer, and I was at a coin show in a little town called Camden, South Carolina. And I noticed a gentleman walking through the different displays there who was obviously from India. And I probably was the only dealer there with coins from India, so I gave him the usual signal, come this way. And he came over and I said, are you from India? Yes, I am, he said. Well, I've got a bunch of Indian coins here if you'd like to look. And he was fascinated. He started digging through those. And I asked him my traditional question that I would ask of anyone who's a foreigner in the United States. I would say, have you ever been in an American's home for a meal? And his answer was, no. How long have you been here? 2 years. By the way, I almost never get any other answer than that from any foreigner I have ever met. The answer is almost always no, unless they bumped into some Christians who are sharp on this point. So I said to him, well, Rahul, why don't you come to our house for a meal? And he was kind of sheepish at that point. He said, well, I'd love to, but, I'm Hindu, and we don't eat meat. Oh, my goodness, you've been rebuffed. What do you say then? Well, there's a very easy way to get around this problem. I said, well, Rahul, why don't you and your wife come to our house and teach us how to make vegetarian food? And you should have seen this guy's face light up. Wow, you want to learn about my way of eating food? And if you think this is unusual, I had a gal working with Bhutanese refugees in Lansing, and she would invite them into her home, and she would ask them to cook their food and teach her how to eat that food. And, or rather, I guess that's sort of obvious you're going to eat the food, but, well, maybe not so obvious, because sometimes it can be a little spicy, can't it? A little different from what you're used to. And through that, an amazing thing happened. I'm not going to tell the whole story because it's kind of long. One day, she's standing at the door of her church. After just asking good questions, listening, learning how to cook their food, eating their food, showing hospitality, all of a sudden, through the front doors of her church come 30 Bhutanese refugees. And she's kind of taken aback. I mean, really? You're coming to my church? And so she asked kind of the leader gentleman of the group, kind of sheepishly, how come you all came? And the fellow launches into a speech. He says, well, look, he said, the Bhutanese Buddhists treated us brutally, burned our villages down, killed some of our people, drove us into exile. We went to Nepal. We speak Nepali. That's our mother tongue. But they didn't resettle us in Nepal. They kept us for 20 years in refugee camps. Finally, we were able to come to America, and you are the first people who have ever showed us love. So, we've decided to become Christians. Well, now, by the way, don't necessarily assume that means conversion. That might be very much of a cultural thing. But this gal built some amazing bridges to that community, and without ever even having to say the name of Jesus, because they were teaching her about their culture, they became her people. And when they became her people, they said, we want your God to be our God. Just like Ruth. And over time, many of those people then did become followers of Jesus, and they got baptized and became part of her church. So the second Boaz principle is hospitality, the importance of opening your home to other people. And the passage is from chapter 3, verse 14, where it says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, that is Ruth, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. Now, you may think wine vinegar is maybe not the most thrilling thing to eat with bread, but the fact of the matter is that was the best you could offer in hospitality. That was the most choice, the most expensive item on the menu. So Boaz is pulling out all the stops. He's showing hospitality. He's saying, you're used to eating just grain that you can grind up. I'll give you fresh bread, and I'll let you dip it in the finest stuff we've got. And by the way, I have been so impressed with foreigners through the years who, when they have me over to their house, they pull out the stops and they feed me the best stuff they've got. My wife experienced that in Iran with a family that fed her a huge feast, and she forgot her pocketbook. So she went back the next day to retrieve her pocketbook, and she happened to come at lunchtime, and the people were too embarrassed to invite her to sit down to eat because all they were eating was rice. They'd spent their budget for the month for food on feeding her. Remarkable. Hospitality. And Boaz shows it in all of its beauty. And by the way, the best hospitality is learning other people's food. So let's go on. Third Boaz principle is provision. How do we provide for those who have needs? We don't provide by necessarily giving them everything they want. but we set the stage for them to do okay in our context. So verse 17 said, "So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. When she had threshed the barley, she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah." That's about 30 pounds. Now, when you glean in a field, if you can get a quart, you're doing pretty well. How did she get 30 pounds? Well, Boaz was telling the guys who were gathering the sheaves, leave some stalks behind, leave plenty of stuff for her to glean. In other words, he didn't give her a bunch of stuff, but he allowed her to be successful in what she was doing. He provided for her needs. Now, obviously, we don't have any people today who are in that kind of a circumstance. How can we help them? Well, just one quick example, and I think I mentioned it last year. One of my good friends, George, has noticed that when refugees and immigrants go to buy a car, they're almost always charged far more than an American would be charged for the same vehicle. They get gypped because they don't know the system. So George's ministry is to go with immigrants when they buy a car, and he makes sure they get an honest price. Now, that's provision. You're not paying for the car, but you're making sure that somebody doesn't get gypped. How about teaching somebody how to drive? I've done that. In fact, I was with my immigrant friend when he had his first car accident. There's a reason for empty church parking lots. Just do it in the parking lot carefully, okay? But I know many churches that are teaching people how to drive, that are giving them English as a second language services. Friends, there are many ways, like Boaz, that we can make provision for people's needs. Well, I have one final principle, one last thing to mention, and we'll close with this. What's the fourth principle? Well, the fourth principle comes when Ruth actually proposes to Boaz. Now, we often think of Israelite culture as being highly patriarchal, but in this particular instance, the gal makes the marriage proposal. And here's what happens. She lays down next to him. He wakes up and says, "Who are you?" That's verse 9. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." When you read a passage like this, in any book, any passage in the Old Testament, the most important question for you to ask is, where is Jesus in this story? And here you have him, the concept of the kinsman redeemer, the one who would redeem the family of Naomi and Elimelech. Well, we have a kinsman redeemer in Jesus, don't we? He's the one that knits us together as the family of God, as the children of God. And so here's my thoughts for you. It's wonderful to make provision for people. It's beautiful to show them hospitality. It's great to listen. But don't forget the fourth step. They need to hear about the kinsman redeemer who makes you his child through his blood. So friends, let's just briefly review those four principles. Number one, listen to your people and allow the Lord's compassion to move you. Number two, practice hospitality. Open your home to the foreigner, even if it means you need to let that foreigner cook for you and teach you how to eat their food. Number three, make provision. Help your people in the process of adaptation to this new culture. And then finally, number four, share the good news of the kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ.